What is pseudo-intellectualism? Are we able to make a clear distinction? Are we able to clearly separate intellectualism on the one hand from pseudo-intellectualism on the other hand? What are the characteristics? What are the key characteristics of pseudo-intellectualism that might help us to identify whether or not somebody is a pseudo-intellectual? And this, I think, has become a particularly pertinent, relevant problem within the 21st century, in the what we can call the internet age, in which masses amount of information about all sorts of different sorts of subjects is readily available to us in the form of YouTube videos, in the form of blog posts, should count over here, news articles, I can't count to three, websites like Wikipedia, websites like the Encyclopedia Britannica. We have all of this information that's available to us. And the danger with having information overload is that sometimes, oftentimes, most times, it's difficult to figure out whether or not we can trust that information. And this is one of the big areas, I think, the big ways or reasons why we've seen the rise of pseudo intellectualism. But pseudo intellectualism, or calling someone a pseudo intellectualist, is also one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot because it's kind of hard to pinpoint what exactly makes someone a pseudo intellectualist. So that's what I want to explore today. This is a response to another YouTube video that came across my feed. I'll link the original video in the description of this one, in which the interviewer goes around and asks various philosophy professors what makes someone an intellectual or what makes someone a pseudo intellectual. And I'm going to give my own spin based off of the area of history and philosophy that I like to focus on, which is the history and the philosophy of science. So let's go ahead and jump into it.
What do you think differentiates an intellectual from a pseudo-intellectual? Are there different types of intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals that we should distinguish, or can they be categorized under their umbrella terms?
When you call someone an intellectual, it's because you think that they know a great deal about a great deal. And that's where that title comes in.
Okay, so what makes somebody an intellectual versus a pseudo intellectual? Like I said, I'm going to take this in a slightly different angle because one of the big questions within the philosophy of science over the 19th and 20th century was this question of what we call demarcation, which is how do we distinguish science on the one hand from pseudoscience on the other, in that the prefix pseudo there signifies that something's false. So when we say pseudoscience, we're indicating that it's bad science, it's false science, it's wrong science. In the same way, if I call something pseudo archaeology or pseudo history or pseudo medicine, whatever it is, we're indicating that that thing's wrong. Well, this naturally raises the question, if we're calling someone a pseudo intellectual, well, then what we have to first figure out what we mean by what makes someone an intellectual. And in the same way, the problem of demarcation, how do we distinguish science from pseudoscience? In answering that question, the reason why it's so important is that we also have to figure out, okay, well, what exactly makes something science? And as I've mentioned, I believe in a few other videos, this question's actually really difficult to answer. And it gets more difficult once we start to take history into consideration. So, if we look at the history of science, how far back do we go? Where do we start from? What do we consider as a part of the history of science? Because if we go all the way back to the ancient world, then we run into the problem of having to consider disciplines that nowadays we definitely would not consider science, such as astrology or alchemy or mixing medicinal practices with religious practices. All of that has played a part, and I would say that all of that has played a really foundational part in the history and the development of science as we know it today. But are those things sciences? Well, on the one hand, we want to say yes, but on the other hand, we would want to figure out the ways in which they are not. And that's the problem of demarcation. And unfortunately, there there hasn't really been a clear philosophical consensus on how we demarcate one from the other. Just like nowadays, there's not really a clear cultural consensus on what makes an intellectual versus a pseudo intellectual. But again, the problem then becomes, well, what are the criteria that we're using to make that determination?
Someone and say, well, that person's really intellectual, what they mean is they not only have the knowledge, but they have the ability to apply that knowledge in a broader context.
So, in the sciences and in the academic world, one of the criteria that we use to determine whether or not somebody is an intellectual, and I'm going to use intellectual and expert kind of loosely interchangeably here, but one of the ways that we can identify somebody as an intellectual or an expert is if that person has a academic background or training in the area in which they are speaking about. So, is a person, and you can go into specific examples of this in the sciences. What makes somebody a scientist, what makes somebody a chemist, is if they have some sort of educational background in chemistry and if they have worked on the particular problem that they're speaking to. What makes somebody a biologist is if they have an educational background in biology and if they've worked on, researched, did field investigations, whatever it is, into that area of biology that they're speaking about. And it's the same with other disciplines too, like history, archaeology, education, take your pick. But I think we need to make further distinctions here because we don't want to say that everybody who does not have a biology degree is a pseudo intellectual in matters of biology. And for me, as someone who teaches history, I want to encourage my students, for example, to love history, love to learn about history, to really dig in to an aspect of the past that they're really interested about. And one of the ways in which they do that is they start reading, studying, sharing with their friends what they're learning about. They start talking about it. But I wouldn't therefore call my student a pseudo intellectualist or a pseudo historian. So we also need to be clear in our distinctions, not to exclude those people who are just getting into the discipline or who don't have some sort of prestigious academic background. Just because you don't have an academic background doesn't mean that you're a pseudo historian or pseudo intellectual, however you want to, whatever category you want to put there. If that makes sense, would love to hear your thoughts on that. But let's continue with the video. But with pseudo intellectuals, there is something that they're doing wrong or that we want to identify as being fundamentally incorrect. So what exactly is that thing? What's wrong with pseudo intellectuals?
Arguments, they pay attention to evidence, they try to make sense of things and so on. If you do these things not for the purpose of actually, yeah, it's difficult to describe what the right purpose is. But if you do that for for the wrong kind of purposes, for political purposes, for financial purposes and so on, that I think is a common motive for being a pseudo intellectual, and that's what they actually usually do.
So I like this distinction because it points out that pseudo intellectuals are pursuing or giving the facade of pursuing an intellectual activity, pursuit, gaining knowledge about a particular subject matter for some sort of other gain besides learning about that. And I think you can see this nowadays, what we would call or who we would identify as like being a grifter, somebody who enters in a particular space, a cultural space, an intellectual space, some sort of community in order to get money from or profit in some way, shape, or form from that community, whether that be financially profit from or culturally profit from. If you've ever heard the expression of like culture vulture, somebody who's using a culture in order to elevate their status. So it could also be like their social status, whether or not to gain clout, as my students would say. So let's continue down this line of reasoning to figure out what other sort of characteristics we can apply. And then I want to add something to the conversation that's been said so far.
With that said,
Okay, there's a caveat.
I think pseudo-intellectual has a pejorative attached to it. We generally think that pseudo-intellectualism is bad.
Mhm.
I'm roughly in agreement, but I just want to flag the way that I think that sometimes pseudo-intellectualism could be totally awesome.
Hmm.
It's like, oh, some people, I think, want to pursue their intellectual capacities to share information with the world. That's not exactly for the sake of truth in and of itself. It's some sort of like service act, or it's for entertainment. Like it's fun to learn things sometimes. It's fun to share that information with other people. There is a way to look at this channel, I might say, as that thing, though I wouldn't ever accuse you of being a pseudo-intellectual.
Yeah, so this sort of gets to what I was trying to point out earlier, which is that I don't think that we want to call anybody who is not an academic or anyone who does not dedicate their entire life, for example, to studying archaeology. I don't think we want to call somebody who has not done that, but who still likes to learn about and talk about archaeology a pseudo intellectual. That is to say, I think we want to leave room for people who have a personal interest in that subject, people who are popularizers. So, for example, people on YouTube who love to make videos about philosophy. Just because they like to make videos about philosophy, but they don't have a philosophy degree, I'm not going to call them a pseudo philosopher. So, I think we want to leave open that space. But there is an important criteria that I think was missed in this discussion that I think is one of the paramount features of pseudo intellectuals that we have to watch out for. And really, what got me thinking about this is last semester at the school that I teach at, we were doing this project for my ninth and 10th grade learners at the school. And for their project, they were doing some future projections about how the world was going to look. And in order to do that, they were investigating and research how the world is now. And one of the popular topics that came up was that of climate change. So I was encouraging my students to do their own research. I had shown them some ways in which to do that research. And I was having a conversation with the student because one of the sources that they had linked was a YouTube conversation by Jordan Peterson, and I can't remember who it was talking about climate or having a debate about climate change, and they listed that as a source to support their point. And so I had to have this conversation. We have to be careful where we're getting our information from. In the debate, Jordan Peterson was pushing back on the claim that climate change is primarily caused by human beings, or I think he was pushing back that climate change and climate research and how we're pushing and supporting climate research is actually hurting people. I don't remember what his exact argument was, but he was dissenting from the agreement of climate scientists. And so, what I would add here to the criteria of pseudo intellectual is that pseudo intellectuals support and push ideas or positions that don't have a basis in sound scholarship, that they're promoting some alternative theories in whatever field that they happen to be in. So, prime example of that would be the example of Jordan Peterson pushing ideas that most climate scientists would disagree with or that is not supported by the existing literature within climate science. Another prime example of this, someone who I've made multiple videos about on this channel, would be like a Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock supports and pushes ideas that have been largely rejected and refuted by what he would identify as mainstream archaeologists. So a pseudo intellectual, to make this distinction between a pseudo intellectual and a popularizer, the primary difference here is I think a pseudo intellectual pushes ideas that doesn't have scholarly support, ideas that have been either rejected amongst scholarly consensus or ideas that don't have a lot of evidential backing, that don't have a lot of secondary literature that they could cite that would support their claims. But I would be curious to hear what you think. Is there a different criteria that me and these other philosophers are missing in the distinctions that they're making? Go watch the original video. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you all next time.